from taking a picture, so I don't know.
Oh, watch out.
There, okay, yeah, you can run.
Got a great phrase for radio.
Oh, doing good.
Yeah, it's part of the problem.
You got props. I got pizza straight
Where are you going? All right, welcome everyone, and welcome to everyone joining us on Facebook Live to Can Everybody Hear Me? Can everybody hear me? A panel on mic etiquette with tips on reading your work in front of an audience. Before I introduce our mic experts, I want to let you know about some other upcoming events. In particular, our next member meetup, which happens every first Thursday of the month, is May 2nd. And this is a special Works in Progress edition. So club members are welcome to sign up to read their work. So look for more information on that on our next newsletter. Go ahead, you can also go ahead and grab a calendar while you're at the club. And we also have a handout on opportunities to read your work in front of open mics across Rhode Island. So our panel today, we have 3 panelists with deep experience behind mics and hosting author readings. They're here to give us some insight and courage to perform our own work in front of an audience. Cecil Hickman is a member of What's Your Writers Club. He's a retired journalist, educator, and media consultant with experience in commercial radio, public radio, television, and newspaper. Cecil taught broadcast performance at the University of Missouri, University of Florida, University of Tennessee, Iowa State University, and Cleveland State University. Cecil also works with a nonprofit for veterans, dog tags, navigators. Robin Call has been connecting readers and writers for almost 20 years, from her can't miss author events and monthly reading series to her weekly-ish podcasts and active Facebook pages. Robin will tell you what to read. She can either be found with a book in her hands or with her beloved corgi, Vinny Irving, in her lap. Oh, we need Vinny here with us.
I wanted to bring it. It was discussed.
And Fallon Masterson is the co-founder and producer of Stranger Stories, the bi-monthly reading series here in Rhode Island, featuring true stories by local writers. Her essays and articles have been featured in Motif Magazine, Vanyaland, and the Providence Phoenix, among others. She holds degrees in media studies and writing, literature, and publishing from Emerson College. So welcome and thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us.
I'd love to see your audience.
So I'm going to concede the stage and let each of our panelists share from their experience. After they present, we want to open it up if anyone has any questions, and they can just discuss among themselves, offering any other tips. And then there'll be a chance if anyone in our audience wants to practice reading from a mic. So Cecil, would you like to start us out here?
Yes, I'd like everybody just to follow my actions just for a little bit. Maybe you can critique me, but you might see some common mistakes. All right? Please notice, it's 5 minutes before airtime. Hello? Anybody? 20 stories, bookstore, open mics, 20 stories, ask you Providence, Petchoka, Providence. All right. Jamestown, Philomene, Library Poetry Night, open mic night at Brooklyn Coffee Tea and Guest House, Providence Poetry Slammer, A220. Welcome to the show. Okay, I don't know what each and every one of you are interested in. If you're interested in doing a play, podcast, going on air, bookstore kind of thing, I'll sit down so I can be in frame. But there are a lot of mistakes made in going from writer to performer. That was my experience. So as a newspaper reporter, you wrote the inverted pyramid style and you got all the facts and you typed it up. Then you went into television. It was all about primping, you know. You had to have your look. One of the mistakes I made offhand at the bat was I was drinking a lot of caffeine. Interesting. So when I ran a newsroom, I had to ban caffeine from my students because They were going in the air, and they were talking just like this. You know, they'd been up all night studying everything, got in the morning, get in the air. This is the news. They had mega accidents right here this morning. So when I got rid of the caffeine and stuff like that, they settled down to a normal conversation.
Oh, man.
One of the things that I did was cough. A major element, and I learned this from my voice coach, Ann Utterback, is a healthy voice. So I had cold water here. It's better to have tepid water, not cold water. Get in the habit of not freezing your vocal cords. Stay healthy, stay in shape. It's a very good technique. Anxieties are a major problem using the mic, going on the microphone. You have to learn how to deal with it. Sometimes there are calming techniques that you can do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Another thing is to get your mouth muscles loosened up. Get them relaxed. That can look hilarious. Warm up your voice. Yada yada. Do re mi fa sol la ti do. Do re mi. Hear my voice crack. Do re mi fa sol la ti do. Do re. So there are things that you need to warm your voice up, just like a singer. I think that's very important. I'm just giving a few tips here. We can answer questions a little bit later because I prefer not to give a speech on this. I prefer to coach because this is a performance. Now, one thing I'll say about writers, that the fact that you know structure, character, you know all of those kinds of things should help you in your performance. It should be an advantage because I listen to podcasts now and I'm going, you gotta be nuts. You know, it makes no sense. There's no beginning, middle, or end. So it should help you once you learn the tricks. So when you go from writing for newspapers and writing for radio, you write in a structure that's different. It's not the inverted pyramid. It's more like a layer cake. You're just giving bits of information. When you write for television, you're writing to the video. You're writing to the video. It's a whole different style of writing. I'm finding out that when you're trying to write a play, which I'm starting to do, imagine my shock that it's not just one or two quotes, it's 25 quotes a page. It's dialogue. Whoa, what is that all about? I didn't know that there were beats in a script. There are certain beats that you do. I didn't know that. I thought that was just music. So any different kind of style that you take on, as a writer, you begin to adjust. When you make a mistake when you're on the air, you have to learn how to mask the mistake. So those are some of the things that I learned, and I'll stop now. I freaked you out, and I'll turn it over to you.
It's interesting that you talk about masking a mistake. Were you supposed to correct it, or you're supposed to?
Well, you mask it so that the public doesn't know you made a mistake.
Ow! See, I always thought you were supposed to acknowledge the mistake in some way.
You can't. That is one way,
Yeah.
but your first attempt is to mask it.
That's always the first attempt. I think that's fascinating because my story really, I started out on radio, but I started out as a caller to a radio show. So I had no school, no experience, no broadcasting background or anything. So it was all just how I thought it would sound. And when you were doing the breathing, it just brought back such a time because it's not something that I was taught to do, but I was really being triggered watching that because when I was first, it was good to remember that back 17 or 18 years, when I was on the air, I was on Saturday mornings on HJJ, and my producer and I had a little dance, and she was telling me I was sounding breathy. I didn't know what that meant until I listened to the tapes, and I heard that. And because I don't have stage training, I'm not going to attempt to sing that little song or anything. So it's just, you have a conversation, but you realize when you're performing, and it is a performance, whether it's a call into a radio show, or standing at the stage, or having a conversation in front of an audience, that was not something that came naturally to me. But when I listened to it, and it was painful. to really, I could hear that anxiety, and I guess just learning how to breathe through. Apparently breathing solves a lot of problems. I mean, this is what I've learned.
Important.
Right? That's breathe. So when we do it, we host a weekly. We host it feels weekly. Somehow the third Tuesday comes up so fast. We host a reading series, an author series on third Tuesdays. And one of the things, Ann and I were talking earlier about connecting with an audience when an author is up there, and it was called a reading series originally. We've changed it more author series because we've morphed it into more of a performance. The authors do read 4 pages, give or take. And what we suggest is a combination of reading and storytelling, because it all starts from the story. Everything that we're here to talk about is the authentic story that you want to tell. And readers can read when it doesn't feel, when it isn't coming across that way, and your audience can also feel it. And so practicing is really important. And I think when you're invited to, whether it's a store, a bookstore, or a panel discussion, is to really take in what is being asked of you. So if you're told you have 10 minutes, we always give people a 2-minute warning. A little gentle music, sometimes it's a little bit loud, sometimes, and I understand you're up on the stage and 10 minutes can fly, or it can feel like, when I would be on the radio when there was dead air, you can't have dead air. So it's really helpful to have a partnership when you go to a reading with the person who is organizing it, so that you're a team. Don't just leave me on the stage, give me a heads up, let me know, because you can certainly lose track of time. And I would also say when you're invited to perform and to read your work, know a little something about the series, know a little something about how it's staged with that, as opposed to, oh, we were invited to this, I think you guys are still doing this thing, or something like that. It's really a turn-off. You'd be surprised. And we have suggested this combination of storytelling and reading, and some authors, and that's cool, they choose to just, it's not cool when they choose to just read, because that is way too long, in my opinion, to read. The audience does not connect well with that after a while. There are a few exceptions. And then authors that have chosen to just do storytelling and not read at all, that isn't a great idea either, which was surprising to me, because some of these authors are so entertaining and engaging. I would want to buy the book just for that reason, but Ann and I were talking about book sales. We've noticed an absolute connection between the way the audience is perceiving the author, and you can see people shaking their heads, they're laughing, they're engaged, and book sales. It is an absolute correlation. And so we've tried to share that, and we send an email to publicists and authors, and Emily writes it out. It is if somebody takes time to read it, all the information is there bulleted, and we make these suggestions to have the authors have the best possible experience on our stage, because that's why we've invited them. But absolutely, if you're looking at book sales, and let's face it, people are writing books and they want to sell them. If anybody says that's not the case, then write in your journal. Fine. So that's another podcast or another show, I think. But we've absolutely seen that sales are translated from engagement in the audience, and there's something for everybody. You don't know what somebody's going to connect to, but we carefully curate the series so that there's an author for everybody, that's coming to enjoy.
So 4 pages takes about how long to read? So out of the
Should
10
be 2
minutes,
or 3 minutes. I mean, we
wow. Okay, so out of the 10 minutes, it's really like 7 minutes personality on
Freeform.
stage?
We prefer it, and we understand everybody isn't so cool with that. But what we say is, and people who have said, well, I'm more comfortable reading.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised when they get up there and then just start talking. We've had people talk about, one guy read an email that he had written to his editor about the cover of his book. I might have used this example. It was hilarious. One of the authors came, she had forgotten her luggage. So when she arrived in Providence, she had to go to Thayer Street and go to the secondhand shop and get some clothes. And she talked about her toothpaste procedure at CVS. It was really, and maybe not the way I'm explaining it, but it was really funny. So it doesn't, people want to know a little bit about the author, whether they take their pizza strip and heat it up, or whether they eat it cold. I mean, that's entertaining. It's amazing what people will find to connect to, and then the story goes from there. then they're going to be engaged in what did you write, and if that comes through in the performance, it's going to translate. So
this may be a dumb question, but would you, if you
there are no
10
dumb
minutes,
questions.
would you want to put your reading of your book in the front or at the end, or how do you decide when,
Most people
how to
get up.
organize it?
That's a good question. Most people get up and they will start just talking. It could even be how they got to Providence, how they traveled. Had they ever been here? What's their connection to the city when they come? A lot of people have friends here, they visited, or they've heard things about it or whatever. It really could be anything. And then usually they'll read at the end. Or sometimes they'll read the prologue and then go from there and talk about maybe their research or why the book, what was the nugget, what started the story, why is this important, why did I want to write it, why do you want to read it, like that. But we have had a few cases where people have just straight on read, and we're on the side going like, trying to give gentle signals, and we've coached. We do prep people, so it should come as sort of no surprise, and yet sometimes it does. So yeah.
Cool.
I really liked how Robin said when you're talking about the context of your series, you call it an author series versus a reading series. With Stranger Stories, when we're talking about our show, we usually refer to it as a live lit night. We turn away from this concept of it just being a reading series because, as Robin said, it really is so much of a performance. When you're up there, it can't be just reading line by line, head down, which can be so complicated for a writer, especially, it's a complication I'm very sympathetic to. We began Stranger Stories last May, and a large part of the reason that we began the series was I really want the crutch of holding paper. We're a narrative nonfiction series, so we feature first-person, true-to-life writing. There's a lot of great storytelling series around Rhode Island. There's Live Bait, there's Tell Newport, Pachacacha is also off book, and you can, they have slides, which can sort of be your crutch, but if you are someone who wants the paper and wants to share your work, I wasn't finding a space for myself where I could be comfortable and not have to be off the cuff. But that being said, even though you have your paper ahead of you, you do have to consider how you're writing your piece for a live audience versus what you might be writing at home. The pieces that we tend to feature, and I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about narrative nonfiction and personal essay for the purposes of this, but I think it'll cross over to if you write poetry or fiction as well. For us, we tend to encourage people to submit stories between 5 to 10 minutes when reading out loud. 8 minutes seems to be, 10 minutes is an exception. The piece has to really be flowing along to ask an audience to sit for 10 minutes. I know it seems like it should be short, and if you're used to long form writing, you could certainly fill 10 minutes with very complicated sentences. And when I'm editing pieces that I wrote for the pleasures of writing versus something I'm going to read out loud, I always have to edit myself to take out my parentheses, to take out all my dashes, all the ways that, if I use sentences that have a lot of semicolons in them, I'll always strip my content down to be more digestible to an audience. 8 minutes seems like it's about 1,500 words, depending on the speed at which you read. So that's usually what we'll ask people to target, 1,500. We've noticed for stories that might be a bit more successful, stories that people seem to respond strongly to, a great first sentence, a strong lead, however your parlance is. I know it sounds gimmicky to be like, come in with a really crack first sentence, but it's so true. Even if, perhaps if your writing style, if you're someone who's a bit more understated or you enjoy using more metaphor, I would consider how you edit. And again, it's not speaking so much about if you're a poet, but I would consider how much you're I would risk being less understated than might feel natural to you as a writer. It might feel like you're hitting people over the head with your point, especially if you are a writer who feels a bit more introverted and it's stepping out of your comfort zone to read out loud. But your beautiful writing could leave an audience's mind wandering if you don't put a pin on it for folks. And I think within that, and I'd be curious to hear Robin's thoughts too on like choosing an excerpt if you have a larger body of work of what's made that compelling. If you're writing specifically for a series, you'll want to consider your stakes. Get a beginning, middle, and an end in there, which you totally can do even if it is only 8 minutes. A lot of these storytelling series like Nonfiction that have a similar style to Stranger Stories, you'll hear people say, oh, well, how do I choose my story? And you'll see people say things like, write down a story that sounds good in a bar. Like, write down a story you would tell at an intimate dinner party. A story that if someone shared it with you, you would, sit up a little straighter hearing it.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of things we've seen that can be a little less successful or things you might want to avoid, this sounds obvious, but avoid imitating accents. It could be uncomfortable if you are there. Yeah, there's definitely a space to act out, and because I write about my mother a lot. I write nonfiction, so I definitely have like a face and a voice I do for my mother. And
what does she think of it?
She's accepted it. She's accepted it. So I guess what I'd say is you should have some fun with act outs and with dialogue and finding your comfort zone with how you feel comfortable moving or taking a little stroll, but definitely be respectful of not getting into voices that are going to alienate your audience. I would also say don't read off of your technology. Like there's there's a reason this is here.
So don't read off of your phone.
Yeah, we've had authors do that. I mean, they also can die as a charge.
Do you
There's
feel
that.
the energy change in the room?
Yeah, I feel like they're like scrolling, or maybe they're really checking their email.
Yes.
But they're talking to us, and I don't like it. I agree. But I'm old school.
I know that when we've done podcasting classes, and often people will say, don't bring a piece of paper into the room because it can make noises on air. How do you deal with that? I mean, in that instance, would you read off of an iPad, or would you take down your paper, or how would you handle that for the microphone?
I usually read off a script if it's a scripted event, like a news story.
But a piece of paper,
podcast,
or
you learn how to be quiet.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
You probably.
It's a good point.
If I had to suggest, is that you record yourself, and after you record yourself, walk away, get a cup of coffee, something,
So we can have coffee now.
then go back. Well, so that you become a different person.
Yeah.
You don't become the tree, you see the forest for the trees. So you come back and you listen to it critically, edit it tightly, notice the breathing, notice if you're popping your piece, notice if you talk across the mic or whatever. If you hear the paper rattling, you learn to be still, So sometimes I would bring the paper underneath so it's off mic. So any rattling is off mic. You understand what I'm saying? Or if I have to cough, I will turn my head and it's off mic. So the mic is picking everything up. So their best thing, as I suggested, is to listen to yourself. The second best thing is find someone on air who you really like. You really like that person. And just like a singer will sing with a person that they like, sing with the voice that you like. If it's an anchor person, talk with them. You don't have to have a script. Just talk with them and you'll catch the tricks that they're doing. You'll catch the breathing things that they're doing, the breathing techniques. It's a really quick way to understand the technique of it. Have I lost you?
You know, it's so
I think that's a
interesting
really
with the,
good point. So if
with
you
the
were to do a
paper.
stranger stories, which you should, that would be so cool. You would practice it a few times and tape yourself and listen to it before you went on stage.
Yes, I would critique it. But for example, I used to like Charles Perrault and Walter Cronkite. Well, I can't talk like that. Well, I finally realized, so you find somebody else who sounds like you, and you just talk with them as you will catch the tricks. You'll see how they're doing a breath pause. Then you'll feel how they mark up the script. With no commas, ellipsis. Ellipsis to indicate the breath pauses, for example. You would write not in, you would write it, the line spacing would be 3 line spacing. 3, not 1 or 2.
So
3.
it's lots of white space between each line.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
It's
Yeah.
really an important way to sight read it pretty well.
Are there any tips that you at Stranger Stories give people for sight reading?
It's interesting. We had someone read at the series who came from a broadcast background, and when she came that night, I saw that she had like a stack of papers. I thought, oh my gosh, did she make her piece longer? What happened? But then I realized what she had done was exactly what her page looked completely different than it would when she wrote it in paragraph structure. She had broken out words to remind herself to pause. It was all short sentences, large font, so she formatted for ease.
So did she leave it out? See, I hide that stuff.
She had a podium, so other people didn't see it, but I saw when she came in.
Yeah, when I host an event and I'm welcoming the audience and I'm interviewing, or I would be horrified. But they're my little tricks, you know, but when you're explaining them to people and I'm listening to the way you're talking about it, yeah, big font or the way an accent's going to go over a word or how you're going to pronounce it, or things that you know maybe might trip you up. Because once you have it in your head that it probably will, so you sort of account for it.
There's also a rule of 3s that I like to talk about. The rule of 3s permeates your writing for anything. If you have a series of items, you keep it to 3 items, all right? When I prep for a script, I go through it 3 times. The first time, I read it, and without, pre-reading it, read it, and any mistake I made, I circle that mistake, all right? Just read it, circle that mistake if you do a glitch or something like that. All right, the second time I read it, I'm reading for content, make sure the contents are. The third time is the final time I'm reading, and I notice the circles. And I said, oh, let me practice how I'm going to say so that I don't make that particular mistake. Or I will change the word. I will change it.
Sometimes I do that too. I'm like, this was a good word, but this one is going to be better. It's not going to trip me up. I don't want that word. Yeah, that is a really good tip. And Fallon, you were asking about how to choose what you want to read. Yeah, I was trying to remember. I knew you had a really good question. I would say to choose an excerpt that doesn't require more setup than what you're actually going to read. Because we've had that experience where an author says, okay, so this is what you need to know. And that's a 3-minute setup, and I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? No. So that's why sometimes the prologue, for obvious reasons, doesn't need setup. Just a little bit of setup. We really don't need to know. I know the author loves these characters, and they're part of your being, but you can't set that much up. It's just too much. And that, I think, comes with practice also. And the other thing is, what I would suggest, sometimes people will mark up their books and have a few excerpts, and it could be a paragraph. And then they will say, well, don't worry, this one's only 2 minutes. Like, don't warn us. Don't apologize. If this is what you're going to read and this is the time you've set up, own it and perform it. But, I know what they're trying to do, but I think it makes everybody feel a little like, or that's how I perceive it. Come out there and perform your awesome work that you spent all that time writing.
I generally watch for repetition. So when I look at a script, I never say the same word twice. And that makes it much clearer. You want to avoid where the student would write, well, he got to the scene of the fire and they were yelling help. And the quote is, help!
like polypure.
So that stole the point of the sound bite. You know? So you would pick a sound bite and write around it. Or like you're picking a quote that stands on its own, that don't steal from the quote, let the quote be strong, and you set up the quote, is what I'm suggesting.
That's good, yeah, that's a good one.
I think how the point has been made about being careful of your preamble. I think when you are participating in an open mic with a 5-minute limit or a series with a time limit, you also want to be careful of the preamble trickling into the writing itself. I think especially if you are doing a nonfiction, you could have that temptation to be, here's the timeline and biography of my life. Like if you're writing about the time that your band opened for Slash, like, and that's like the point of your series. The piece shouldn't begin with, I took music lessons from 5 to 8, and then I did the, we scene, like show the scene right away. And I'll always, like, and if we get a submission, I'm always skimming to be like, is there dialogue in this piece? Is there, are we showing, not telling? It's all your same basic writing rules. Like, good writing is gonna follow through, but for purposes of excerpts, please, like, don't feel that you need to be limited by your chronology and making sure that the audience really knows your background.
Just like jump in,
and
just go for it. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I can feel it coming, because after all these years of hosting events and series and all of this, there are certain things that you see, and very seasoned writers don't do that. They know. They just, you can tell, and you have to start somewhere. And so this is a really great little show here.
So, sorry, at Stranger Stories, is there a microphone, or are they speaking just loudly to the room?
It depends, because we moved this series around.
Yeah.
It depends on the technology of the space that we're at. Most places do provide a microphone, unless it's a very intimate black box. Then even then the microphone is usually an option, but we might do sound check beforehand and realize that the microphone is overbearing, but there will still be a microphone. And actually I was chatting with Cecil beforehand and saying that one of the things about the microphone, and if you're new to the space, like, I would always recommend, like Rob was saying, be aware of your series, like, go to some shows beforehand. Don't be intimidated by the mic. I think the first times I started doing open mics and reading, I was so scared to touch the microphone. It would be the complete wrong height, and or I'm so afraid that if I start twisting it, it was gonna spin down, and I think, like I said, it's taken me a while to get comfortable reading publicly, and eventually you realize that it's less embarrassing to twist the mic for 5 seconds than to spend 8 minutes.
Well, that just happened with the series, and it's funny because that was one of the things I was going to talk about, is sort of knowing the equipment, and if you know how to maneuver it before you get up there. Or when we were hosting our event at Dayball, I would get up before each author and sort of work with it. But that becomes cumbersome, and I don't know how they want it. I don't want to presuppose that if you're 5, 9, or 10, this is what, it's tricky. So you really do have to know how to handle the microphone, but it is painful to watch somebody trying to just reach up, or they're stooping like this, and and then when you're off stage as the producer of the show, you don't want to embarrass somebody, so it's sort of, we do set that up ahead also. We tell people, know how to manage that, or we get there early and take a look. Being prepared, I mean, that's what you started with coming in.
You have a perfect right to have the mic where you want the mic.
Yes.
That is your right.
Right.
And so that comes into a lot of ways. So if we were doing a mic setup and you had an audience and you're taking a mic into the audience, most professionals will not allow the audience to grab the mic.
Right.
You control the mic.
Phil Donahue.
Yeah.
Do you recommend leaving it in the stand or pulling it out?
It depends on who you are.
Yeah.
See, I'm comfortable with that. I like that. But that doesn't, many people may not like that. This is you, this is tailored to you. That's why I think coaching is the appropriate way of dealing. Let you be you. You don't have to have a perfect voice or a perfect sounding voice. You have to have a really great content. Most people get anxious because they're thinking about themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I had so many students that I really would gang. I said, you're selfish. You're thinking about yourself. It's not about you. It's about what you're reading, what the story is. It has nothing to do with you. And I would have to check them, because they would get wired.
So on that point, how much should, in terms of your writing actual piece, should you balance your sort of internal thoughts and feelings versus the story that's happening in front of you? Like how much of it is seen versus an internal thought?
Well, it'll never be perfect. You'll have up and down days. The goal is to lose yourself, to focus on the copy, focus on the content. If you're ad-libbing and have no copy, then focus on your thoughts. I think when it comes to ad-libbing, which probably happens a lot in this setting, I learned a couple of memory techniques, visualization techniques that allow you to, when you do a stand-up in news and you got a big fire there and you're just ad-libbing, you have a mental picture going through, and that's what you talk to. So there's something called Moonwalking with Einstein. I highly recommend. New York Times bestseller list for a while. You'll learn some visualization techniques that allow you to calm down and tell the story. But you really want to lose yourself, in my view. I think a writer kind of loses themselves, and I think it's the same technique.
Any other tips? A lot of writers tend to be anxious in that performance. I myself, before this event, full disclosure, had like an anxiety dream. I didn't know the name of a new guest speaker. You didn't tell me, Anne.
I think when you own anything, or you're just sort of honest with yourself and the audience, depending on the performance, it relaxes everybody, because it is, no matter how many times people have done things, and we've worked with authors and actors, and they share stories, and you'd think, well, they don't still sort of feel that way, and they do. One thing I would say, and we had this happen at one event, one of the authors definitely had a few too many drinks before one of the events. And so that's not at our series.
And not just coffee.
Yeah, not just coffee. Yeah, no. And the thing is, that when something's never happened, it isn't something that's on my list to be mindful of, because it's never happened. I've hosted for many, many years. This was one of the big summer events. And so now, and I don't want to certainly tell people what to do, it's really tricky, but we've structured the time before the event and where people are so that probably couldn't happen like it did that time. And so the effect of this one author, she definitely rambled more than she normally would, but we think that's what happened. But people do get nervous, and there's medication for that. There's all sorts of techniques. I mean, you can mindfully breathe and all that, but let's face it, there's meds. Taken at the appropriate time will make your performance better. They just will.
So, Fallon, is there anything you tell authors speaking for the first time to make them feel more comfortable at stranger stories?
Sure. I think that if you do feel anxiety, if you're someone who's prone to be nervous, get there early, so you can just feel comfortable in the room. So you can also choose where you want to be seated as a somewhat
anxious your seat too.
I just really took a seat.
I got here early.
I saw the pink chair and I was like, pink.
But it all worked out because I got the aisle seat.
You did get the aisle, and the one went right in the middle, which I wouldn't have picked. I would have moved the chair.
I do think that if you do feel so there's some things that are going to happen that you're not going to have control over. You might not have control over where you are in the lineup. If someone is anxious, and it can fit into the flow of our night, we'll usually put them on first so they can relax. But if you can't control where you are in the lineup, get an aisle seat, be by the door, be by the back, realize that you can get, I prowl around for all of Stranger Stories, and maybe it looks that way because she's the producer. But that's like me dealing with my free-floating anxiety. I'm pacing to like work it out, and I think just being, like Cecil was saying, just being comfortable in yourself, and people are not paying as much attention to whatever weird ritual you're doing to center yourself as
Never as much.
Step outside, prowl around without being disruptive, and just, try to get to the space early to take the, get control of the room a little.
But while you're there early, what you shouldn't do is take your host and try and corner them and ask a whole bunch of personal questions, because realize that the host of the event is hosting an event. They're not just there to entertain you. Because we've had authors who come early to do some of those things, and then, they're there, and it's like time and place. I'm happy to discuss it later, but I'm also producing an event here. That's inappropriate, and sometimes authors will do that. So if you're an author, be mindful of the promotion that's going on, the producing that's going on, and it's not just about the author.
Going off anxiety, do you have any advice on managing emotions that might come up while you're reading, particularly maybe a personal story or?
Oh yeah, I was on the air and this actor died and I cried on the air. It just came up out of the blue, and I cried on the air. So yeah, they can happen. I think there was a network correspondent who had a panic attack.
Yes,
on
and he
the
wrote
air.
a book
Right.
about it, yes.
So these things anything's going to happen if you have a career. Now, he's still on the air. He's still making a living, and nobody cares about that. They just, they really, these things pass. You will get up in the morning and actually breathe, and life will continue to go on. You'll spank your kids and get on with it.
Becomes part of your story too. I think it's really, there are topics that I just couldn't discuss for many years that I can handle depending on the day. I met with an author yesterday and he was telling an incredibly poignant story that wasn't in his book. And we were sitting having it was just the two of us. It wasn't being filmed, but I was like, well, I'm just in tears. It's just, how could I not be? And then so was he, and it was really kind of neat. But that can happen as long as I guess you can collect yourself and go on. I had to do a show right after the station fire. I had to do my radio show, and I was very new on the air. And that was really, really hard to do, because who wanted to talk about books? Nobody was talking about anything really. So that was hard.
Oh, this must happen a bit for you.
We have had folks tear up while they're reading their pieces. It's never derailed any of the readings. The audience has patience for it, so if that was to happen, I would say just don't be afraid of silence. The audience can, it sounds so abstract, the audience, but it is really all just people. Like I said, you wake up in the morning, and it is so much better to just take a breath, put your head down, and continue on. And trust that the room is going to support you, and that if you're that engaged emotionally in your reading, that the audience is also probably having a similar experience, and that their emotions are probably going along with you. So it's not like the robots are judging you for being caught up in the moment. I do think in terms of subject matter, you could work some of that out with open mics if you're not sure if a piece is ready to be told, if it's something that is still maybe more for the therapist than for public consumption. I really can't say enough about going to open mics and working some of those issues out.
Whenever I had to write for an anchor, there's a couple of tricks that you do. I always wrote in active voice, never wrote in passive voice. You're adding words you don't need. I never use adjectives. I let the verb drive all the descriptive things you need. The verb was the most important thing. Subject, verb, object. Always wrote that way. And it's a simpler style to perform. Whereas you get tangled up with a whole bunch of adjectives and all this.
All hell's gonna break. That's it.
What do you think I had first, man?
It's true. It's funny. It's so interesting listening to the way you're talking. I'm imagining different anchors or the way, like the morning shows, how they go, and you don't think about why or how sometimes when you're expressing it like that. It's like, oh yeah, that's what they do, or that makes sense, or yeah.
They write in present tense a lot. It's very, it's a very different style.
And editing, when you're writing, you have the edits, the rewrites. There's so much time for that. When you're live at the mic, you can't go back. I mean, I do a podcast and I edit it. We talked about that when we did a podcast here. And I'm horrified at some of the ums, likes, pauses, whatever, because I try so hard not to do that in real life. So I can edit those out. And I think taking a deep breath and silence is your friend kind of thing helps with some of that. And repeating words, you were saying you don't use the same words. When I'm reading a book and there are some words that jump out, I'm like, oh my God, who edited this? There's so many, there were other word choices and it's so much of the same. How much can you really like one word? So that is something you need to be, I think, aware of when you're on the mic, because you're there for 10 minutes and if you hear a certain word 8 or 9 times, it's just startling. Right. I sometimes, just because it's, I'm a little book nerdy thing, I'll circle things and I'm like, wait, I know that's like not a usual word that I would be, so it jumps out at me. So I'm like, I think I heard that one. I don't know.
Why did I just say nonchalant 3 times in 1 minute?
What's going on? Nonchalant. Yeah, nonchalantly.
Other questions from our audience?
I love this audience. This is a great audience. Very participatory.
Are there any emotions that tend to work best in stories on stage? Is it humor, I'm assuming, is the best, or is sadness, or I don't know?
Well, that's interesting because that gets into mic technique. For example, if you're sitting down and you're crunching your body, it's tough to emote sitting down.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of tough crunching here.
So,
I mean, thank you for bringing that. Recognizing so sitting here.
But if you stand up, you can get into it. You can move your hands and arms, you can emote. That's a good reason to use if you want to put emotion into whatever you're performing. This is a good technique to use.
Okay, now you stood pretty far away from that mic.
Yeah.
A lot of people get much closer, and then I get closer and I get scared that I'm going to
Depends on the
gesticulate
type
and
of
like
mic.
whack into it.
It depends
Because
on
I
the
will.
type of mic. They're cardioid mics, they're all different kinds of mics. You have a dust screen, dust cover there.
Right.
Some people are right up on it.
Oh, I knew, yes, they all do that.
Right. So, you got somebody on the sound over there. She said, hey, back up.
That's the simplest way sometimes. How do I sound? Right.
And then you talk across the mic. You don't talk popping your P's like that. You talk across the mic, or it can be down. You talk over the mic, but never talk directly into the mic. Now, digital microphones, that's a whole new world. I don't know what.
So maybe the best thing would be to show up at a venue early and just do a quick mic check so you really understand how the mic sounds and have a friend in the back.
That's what singers do.
I think a mic check's a great
Have a
idea.
friend.
I always do sound checks for my own events.
Yeah.
Always do a sound check. I get there really early. I'm always on the sound guy. And also, if somebody, I hate that you don't want to say, can everybody hear me? That's like, you don't want to do that. So you want somebody in the back to be involved with that and just manage it. Right. So, because it's just, that does happen sometimes.
Do Stranger Stories own their own mics? Do you carry your mics with you?
We don't know, so we use whatever is at the venue we're at, so that's why we especially get there early so we can get comfortable.
Yeah.
So it's not about being heard, it's about being heard well. I mean, sounding good.
Right. If you can afford it, you might want to get your own equipment.
Well,
But if you can afford it. Because that is an anxiety issue. You go to a place and you're not familiar with their setup, that's a source of anxiety. If you have it,
Right.
you know your own equipment, you're not worrying about your equipment, you're just worrying about your performance. But that's only if you have the bucks.
As much as you can control anything, I think that obviously lessens anxiety. But then there's knowing that you're going to get someplace. For example, when I am asked to host a panel discussion, I like to know what the setup is going to be. Because is it a skirted table? Will I be wearing pants? If I'm wearing a dress? What's the angle shot? You know, and so I will ask. Sometimes they don't know, and so I usually would go with pants anyway because I'm more comfortable. But that's happened where it's like, hoo-ha, what's a woo? Not me, but I've had guests. Not the one who was drinking, although actually might have been her too. But those things that you just, you know, you want to be able to
Or like a
control.
lavalier, you never want to be wearing a dress if it's going to be a lavalier.
Yeah, I've had that happen.
Dress comfortably is a great, just across the board
Yeah, that's
tip.
a-
Yeah.
You want to be comfortable.
Yes,
Yeah.
avoid tight things around your neck, fabric that's going to make you sweat. If nerves are something that you're worried about, dress for comfort.
Yeah, when I would advise a candidate for office or something like that, and they never really did much TV, and they had suits, we would tell them to sit on their coattails, because that would straighten out the line. All right. You gotta watch the Richard Nixon sweat.
Let's face it, he had something to be upset about.
They want to get some makeup. I'm not kidding, guys.
Yeah.
And it used to be, things have changed since I was teaching it, but you didn't want ladies with rings like that, earrings.
It's distracting.
You wanted tight,
Stuff.
you know, like a ball kind of thing or something like that for distraction. It used to be, it's no longer, you didn't want your hair below your jawline. Now that doesn't matter.
Do you guys have any tips about dealing with lights coming in your eyes? And because that's often the hardest part of public speaking for me.
Yeah, that's important for setup. You need to know. If you don't want that light in your eye, you should have solved that issue during the setup, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely.
You know, that's why you have to control things. And if you have an idiot, then get another idiot. You know.
There's always an there is no shortage of those. Yeah, they're everywhere.
So somebody coming into the week actually has that much control over what happens with the lighting?
If somebody asked us, I mean, I think we're a pretty decent judge of what is going to be comfortable. So we set that all up ahead of time. But if somebody said to me, I need a little extra light, I can't, or please make sure there's a place for me to put my drink, that's important too. You should have something to drink. And so just even a little table near a microphone is helpful. But yeah, if anybody's ever asked us for some consideration, we want everybody to be comfortable. And it's always okay to ask.
Oh yeah, I remember I was producing a TV show and Lillian Gish was on. Lillian Gish was 90 years old.
Wow.
And she said, I want you to shoot my left side, that's my better side. I said, you don't have a better side. I didn't say that, but.
There's always a better side.
I didn't say it, but.
Yeah, we can think a lot of things.
I've been to a lot of author events where they're not just reading, but it's a conversation, an interview. And so do you have any interview tips in front of an audience?
That's my preference.
Yeah.
As we've turned this into, as
Yes.
it's turned out.
Yeah.
Tips for an interview,
Yeah.
a conversation. When I do interviews, the only thing I usually tell my author is that I'm going to ask them what they're reading, because that is the only question that trips up an author. When you know your work, who knows their work better than themselves? The one deer in the headlight answer is always, what are you reading? They never remember. So and I've had panels all over, or when I host the podcast, I could always pause the podcast. I don't make somebody look silly. I'll edit out where that pause is. But if it's a live thing, that's the one heads up I'll give. Because it's just a conversation about their own work. So that's the only thing I never really need to be prepped for as well. Don't ask me what I'm reading.
When the students would try to prep for an interview, they would get overwhelmed by all the content they were reading. But really, you're there to ask questions. The person you're interviewing is the expert.
Right.
And so I just said, there's only who, what, where, when, why, and how, and what's next. That's it. You know, just those are the questions that you go through. But make sure that you don't miss a question. You do need to prep. But if you don't ask those questions, then the interview it really doesn't happen.
And listen too, I mean, there's nothing like watching an interview where the interviewee has just been dropped a great bombshell, and then the interviewer goes down to who, where. It's like, did you hear what they just said? Are you present? Are you listening to this?
That's right.
They just like gave you a nugget of gold. Go there, you know? I think you have to really pay attention. That's what I think.
I have one last question, which is if I wanted to submit to Stranger Stories, or any of us wanted to submit to Stranger Stories, what makes a winning story that you're like, yes, I want this person in front of a microphone?
So my other co-producer, Judy Burr, I know how she would answer this question. Judy is always looking for very specific weirdnesses. Something that is and my answer is like a little bit different, but on Judy's end, Judy is reading for, well, I've never met anyone that's happened to before. Well, I've never heard someone talk about this universal experience in this specific way. So it doesn't have to be this mind-shattering thing, but Judy really likes a celebration of our strange specific happenings. I'm always going to choose something that made me laugh out loud at least once while I was reading it, and even if it's a sad story, I don't think we have ever. It's going to be a hard sell for us to ask an audience to sit through a very maudlin piece. So, and it's not that we don't want people to tackle difficult things, because people have. We've put up readers that have went through really challenging pieces, but you should be able to have enough distance from your subject matter where you can balance back and forth where you're going from, even if it's wry humor, it doesn't, like, we're not slapstick, but something if only to give the audience a break, give the audience a moment to laugh and step away from the heaviness. So I would say for us, we're looking for a blend of something specific and something that has a moment or two of levity, even if it is not an entirely humorous piece. It could be a serious topic.
And Caroline, you're reading right now for your next, or you're accepting submissions.
We are accepting submissions through April 21st. The next show is May 30th at AS 220.
And Robin, do you have a reading coming up we should know about?
Thank you for asking. It's always third Tuesdays, and we now are at Askew, which is 150 Chestnut Street. That's our new home. We're very happy there, and it's always third Tuesdays. And coming up this Tuesday, we have 4 awesome authors whose books are all in my bag, but I won't remember titles, so don't ask me. They're all fabulous. Thanks for asking.
Cecil, any last words of wisdom?
Well, I've written 6 podcast plays, so I'm trying to cast them now.
Oh, wow.
And these are voice actors. So we would record in your podcast studio, right?
Yeah.
So, we got to do readings, and we have to, get the rhythm of the writing and all of those kinds of things. So that's what I'll be doing for the next weeks.
All right, well, let's thank our panelists for being here, and thank you for all the words of wisdom. I'm definitely going to try to not at my next open mic appearance. We really appreciate your time and everything.